Thank you. Thank you, Joe, for that lovely introduction. It's really been a pleasure to spend the day with you. And Joe didn't mention that actually he was the one doing the interview with me at the station. And so I guess if you tune in within a month or so, probably on the web and perhaps on a PBS, local PBS station, you can see the two of us talking about China. And really, he's the trooper because this is the third time he has to listen to me speak. So pity to him. I do want to also give a special shout out to my friend Sam because for those of you who don't know him, I may be one of the great think tank scholars, of which there are about 6 in our country, so that's a really small pie. But Sam is really one of the great scholars, period, full stop, of China in the country. And so you're very lucky to have him here with you in Denver. So I am going to talk about China. And there is, always talking about China is always an interesting thing. And this is, I think, an especially interesting time. Because they have just completed the leadership transition. As I'm sure many of you know, the Chinese Communist Party selected the top 7 people that are going to guide the country for the next 5, and in some cases, for some of them, 10 years, back in November. And just last month, they completed the transition for the government positions. And the same people who are the top 7 in the party, for the most part, also hold very senior top positions in the government. So they're really one and the same. But the party really sort of sketches out the overall strategic direction for the country, the ideological direction for the country, and the government is the sort of implementing body for the country. So we have a new Chinese leadership, and I think certainly it's too early to say, definitively where this Chinese leadership is going to take the country over the next 3 to 5 to 10 years. But what I'd like to do is just give you some ideas of what I think are the sort of major transformative processes that are going to shape the country over the next 3 to 5, 10 years, and what I think are some of the early indications about how this Chinese leadership seems to be approaching these issues. And that'll maybe give you a little bit of a framework to think about as you watch China moving forward to see how they're progressing and the direction that they're moving in each of these areas. So first, let me just talk a little bit about the leadership itself, because this is a new group of leaders for the most part. There are only 2 holdovers from the previous Chinese, the top governing body. I think if you think about the letter C, you will have a pretty good sense of what this leadership is all about, because they are primarily coastal, meaning that by and large, 6 of the 7 have spent virtually their entire careers governing as party secretaries or as governors of coastal provinces, the wealthiest, most economically dynamic, and pretty much most strongly integrated with the West regions of the country. Only one of them really has spent most of his career, and that was in propaganda in the interior part of the country in Inner Mongolia. So this is a different kind of leadership because the previous leadership actually had much more experience in the interior, poorer provinces of the country. So it's a coastal, I think, outward-looking in some ways leadership. It's also a reasonably conservative leadership, I would say. There was a lot of political jockeying in the run-up to the leadership selection, through the summer months and into October before the party congress in November. And it looked as though there would be 2 really reform-oriented leaders within what was going to be 7 to 9 top leadership, and neither one of them made it into this group. And so by and large, if you look at the trajectories of these leaders, or what they've accomplished in their past, it's not a group that has distinguished itself by leading with any sort of bold reform. I think that, one of them, Wang Qishan, some of you may recognize the name because he was sort of Hank Paulson's interlocutor for the strategic and economic dialogue for several years. I think he is a real reformer, and he is a bold, strong personality. Maybe the premier, I think, is reform-oriented. It'll be interesting to see how strong a player he can be. But by and large, this group, as I said, has not distinguished itself as a reform-oriented group. That's not to say they couldn't find themselves up against a wall at some point and break open some reforms, but to date, that's not what they are really known for. I think they are, however, basically competent people. And they have, again, governed a number of the largest, most economically successful provinces. And so I think that speaks to their accomplishments, just not sort of innovative leaders. And they're reasonably confident. I think it's clear when you watch Xi Jinping as he travels, as he meets with foreign leaders, U.S. leaders, he's very different from his predecessor, Hu Jintao. There's a much stronger sense of confidence, and a confidence, I think, in China that Hu Jintao did not project. If we think about what the Chinese leadership sort of has as its central goals, just at least what they've seemed to outline in the first few months in the political realm, I'd say there are three. The first is routing out corruption. And when the president Hu Jintao stepped down and the new president Xi Jinping came into power, what they spoke most about was the necessity of routing out corruption, because they both said, this could be the death of the party and potentially even of the Chinese state, because this corruption is so endemic in the country. It's like rotting out in some ways the core of society. And so they're pushing forward, with an anti-corruption campaign. We'll have to see whether it's more successful than the past, 60 years of similar anti-corruption campaigns. But this is what they're moving forward with. And I think they've put their strongest leader, the strongest member of the Standing Committee, Wang Qishan, in charge of this campaign. So it's early days yet, but this is, I think, the direction in which they're headed. I also think there's an element that I call sort of the Gary Lockification of the country, which is to say, our ambassador to China made a pretty deep impression on the Chinese people by his sort of man of the people nature and the way he conducted himself, using a coupon, carrying his own, backpack and suitcase, riding in coach class on an airplane. There was a lot of attention paid, on the web in China and within the Chinese media to this, American official really being sort of very simple, not demanding all of the sort of hoopla and motorcades and all the things that the Chinese leaders, right, tend to, the trappings of political power that the Chinese leaders tend to adopt. And so I think a lot of the positive attention came to Ambassador Locke because of this. And this is something else that the Chinese leadership has adopted as their own, right? So one of the first things that Xi Jinping did was to say, these 8 rules of how party officials should conduct themselves. And it was very much about, no long speeches, no motorcades, no lavish dinners and banquets, all these kinds of things. Again, trying to bring the party to the people, right? To make the people feel as though the party is genuinely representing them and their interests. So I think that's a second thing. I think the third one that's come out very early on is this idea of a China dream. And this is sort of Xi Jinping's, this is his mantra right now. Replacing, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao's harmonious society. I think what precisely the China dream is going to mean remains to be seen. It seems primarily at this point to embody a desire for national pride, I think, and that can be seen in Xi Jinping's calls for a strong military, right, and for the sense that the Chinese should take pride in their traditions. He hasn't really, I don't think yet, outlined what traditions precisely he's talking about, but I think this feeds into that. And I would imagine that as time goes on, there will be some mix of Confucian values that will come into this. But it really is about, I think, developing a sense of Chineseness, right, around which the people can rally. And I think that speaks in many respects to the core central issue for the party and within the political system, and that is the effort to develop a sense of sort of a coherent value system, right, that legitimizes their leadership. Because that's really what's missing at this point for the Chinese leadership is legitimacy. Pillars of legitimacy have been rapid economic growth, some nationalism, and then somehow having been, either been a revolutionary leader or been touched by a revolutionary leader like Deng Xiaoping. And Xi Jinping is the first Chinese leader not to have that sort of imprimatur, not to have had Deng Xiaoping touch him and handpick him to be the next general secretary and president of the country. So the question is, what has this leadership done to earn their positions, right? What have they done? And part of what's missing is this sort of common sense of values, of political values. So I think a lot of what they're doing now is focused on developing some kind of narrative that legitimizes their leadership. In terms of what we might consider to be real political reform, there's not much that one can point to. Of course, it's very early days. I think, early indications would suggest maybe two political reforms, what I would call small bore reforms. The first would be more intra-party democracy, which simply means when the party is selecting, its leadership up the ranks, that you'll have more candidates for a position than the position, right? So you might have 3 or 4 candidates for a position, and the party members can vote and choose. That doesn't extend to the broader population for the most part, the voting part. And then I think some element of what is sometimes called deliberative democracy, which is really at the local level a way of engaging the local people in the political process. Because right now there are not that many ways in which the Chinese people can constructively be engaged in the political process. Aside from protests on the street or via the internet, there just aren't many mechanisms. And what this deliberative democracy really means is, for example, there have been experiments opening the budget at the local level to public review. Right, so you can have people come, they can read through the budget, they can say, these are not my priorities, they can have discussions with local officials. Different little localities where these experiments have been going on have conducted these things differently. But I do think this is one thing that you might see the Chinese leadership push forward on, that they might begin to adopt in a wider way throughout the country, albeit I think very slowly. Because I think they are seeking for ways, again, to legitimize their leadership and to draw the people in a positive way, to give them a sense of being part of the political process. So that's how I see the political realm sort of shaping up right now, and I think what we might expect to see a little bit of moving forward. On the economic front, I think we can all agree that China has really done an extraordinary job over the past 30, 35 years of managing what we might consider to be, front burner economic issues, right? So some inflation pops up here, or they have some decline in exports there, or some problem with too much investment and too much bank lending, a kind of whack-a-mole strategy where that they use the economic levers at their disposal to tamp down one problem, and maybe another one pops up, but they're pretty good at taking care of that as well. And all of that, combined with just the sheer energy of the Chinese people and the force of the manufacturing and export sector, really has produced this economic miracle. The question now that I think that the Chinese leadership is grappling with is, what can they do to take the country to the next stage of economic development? And I think here there are 3 things really that they're focused on. The first is transforming China from a manufacturing center of the world to an innovation center of the world. And you can see this in terms of the levels of investment that they're putting into new technologies, into their research centers and their universities, into enterprises that are working on what they consider to be innovative technologies. They have a huge government research program that they've developed, targeting 7 or so major areas for investment. They want to be known as an innovation nation. But to become known as an innovation nation will require them to undertake some subsidiary reforms as well. And it's not clear that they're prepared to make the changes necessary in those areas. And I would say here what we're talking about is reforming the educational system, right? So that they start to loosen some of the strictures that they place on open debate and research. They change the incentives for academic success away from political connections and this kind of thing to actual merit. I think that's one big challenge they face. They have a challenge in terms of the way that enterprises in the country can access money, access capital, because the state-owned sector sucks up between 80 and 90% of the formal bank lending, of state-owned lending, and they need to find a way to open up some of that lending to the private enterprise sector, which is responsible for a much greater percentage of the patents and innovation and new jobs within the Chinese economy. And they need to do something about intellectual property rights. And I won't say more about that because I would imagine that many of you know about the challenge that China faces with regard to intellectual property rights, because it's a challenge that we face and many, many other countries face with regard to China as well. But you will find many Chinese entrepreneurs now talking about the need for greater intellectual property rights protection for themselves. Right? So it's not simply a matter now of people in the US or other countries saying, you, China, need to do a better job. There are Chinese within China saying, we need to do a better job of protecting our own intellectual property. I think the second issue on the economic front is what Premier Wen Jiabao kept talking about repeatedly, and I think Premier Li Keqiang has picked up on this a little bit, and that is breaking down the vested interests, right? So sort of taking, sort of doing what Zhu Rongji did, Premier Zhu Rongji did in the run-up to the accession to WTO, and that is really forcing more discipline on the state-owned enterprises and really breaking apart some of these monopolies, because the state-owned enterprises, by and large, demand a lot in terms of subsidies for energy, subsidies for land, and many of them are, in fact, money-losing enterprises in essence, and they command, as I mentioned, a lot of the capital. And so that's one of the things that they have on their radar. I will say that the government organization that governs the 120 or so largest state-owned enterprises came out yesterday or the day before in a People's Daily editorial and said that there's not going to be any breakup of the state-owned enterprise sector, and that these are a very valuable and productive force within the Chinese economy. So when you see this kind of thing, that there's a real debate going on within the country, and there's a real political battle underway. So this is something that, Li Keqiang is well aware of this, the premier. It's really a matter of, how adept a political player is, whether he's going to be able to make any progress on this, because they've tried for a number of years and have not been able to. Because I should say, the heads of these SOEs, many of them actually hold ministerial rank. They're powerful political players in their own right. They're not just like being a CEO of a company. They actually have a lot of political power and influence. And so it really is, when you're talking about sort of breaking these SOEs apart, some of them, you're really talking about disentangling that entire web of very powerful political and economic ties, among the sort of topmost echelon within the Chinese leadership. And finally, I'll mention the rebalancing of the Chinese economy. Again, something that the Chinese leadership has had as a priority for 10 years. Right? This was, in many respects, what Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao wanted to accomplish. Developing a more consumer-based, less investment-led economy. They didn't make much progress on this. Right now there's some articles being put out in China that say we are making progress on this. I think it's very difficult to tell whether, in fact, there is progress, but they think this is a necessity, right? That they need to do this, and they need to develop the social welfare net that will give people more comfort in terms of buying more goods, right? So in order to develop a consumer-based society, people have to feel as though their education, their health care, their pensions, all these things are essentially taken care of, right? Because that's what the Chinese people are saving for. They're saving for those medical emergencies, they're saving for their children's education, et cetera. And so until they feel as though the government has put in that sort of that net for them, they're not going to feel comfortable really ratcheting up their consumer purchasing. And so far, I will say, the Chinese government has not done that. They have not done a good job of developing that social welfare net. So we will have to look to see, I think, within the next, really that should be a priority within the next 2 to 3 years, sort of some very major implementable initiatives on that front, and something more than what the last government did, which was something like, health care for everybody by 2011, which boiled down to like $11 a piece, which really isn't going to make a significant dent in the sort of Chinese overall comfort with increasing their purchasing power. I think the major thing that the Chinese government has talked about thus far that they think will have a big impact economically is the process of urbanization. And China is, technically 51% urban now. Chinese definitions of urbanization vary. Many places, many large cities simply claim outlying areas and call them urban. So, farmers and rural industries can be part of a larger urban area. They like to have big populations, so they say you're part of our urban area, but they're not really urban. But this is a major push now. So urbanizing another 300 million people or so over the next 2 decades is something that they want to accomplish, yeah. It's a lot of people. And the interesting thing is it really does bring in a new tension for the Chinese leadership, because the urbanization process, urban residents in China use 3.5 times more energy and 2.5 times more water than rural residents. And these are resources in very scarce supply in China. So this is going to put a lot of pressure on already scarce resources. In addition, one of the things that they've been talking a lot about, as I sort of just mentioned, right, was moving away from this investment-led growth. But the process of urbanization, by definition, will require a lot more investment, right? Housing, roads, airports, whatever, for all these new cities or satellite cities. So, how they balance that, I think, remains to be seen. But this, if there's one thing that Li Keqiang, the premier, has talked about most consistently, it is this process of moving forward in urbanization. Okay, foreign policy. I'm just going to run through these now very quickly because I want to leave plenty of time for questions and answers. I think this new Chinese leadership faces a pretty stark choice at this moment. And the choice is whether or not it should take a step back and put back on the mantle the Deng Xiaoping wore, which was really this idea of hide brightness, cherish obscurity, right? So keep a low profile internationally, focus in on developing your domestic economy, right? Grow your economy and in your political economy. And what we really just want is a peaceful international environment, or whether the new leadership will continue with what has become really a far more assertive Chinese foreign policy over the past few years. And I think it's important to understand the context of that assertive policy, because it really didn't emerge until the global financial crisis. And in the wake of the global financial crisis, you really did get within China, in some sectors of Chinese foreign policy establishment, not the entire establishment, a sense that it was now China's time, that the U.S. had begun the process of its inevitable decline, and China was now, on its upward trajectory, and we were now crossing like this. The time had come. And so you had the Chinese, bank governor, central bank governor saying, time to move away from the dollar as the world's reserve currency. You had the PLA Navy saying, we're moving from a near seas to a far coastal defense, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to say, right? Because China now has, is accessing resources from throughout the world. It has economic interests, deep, throughout the international economy. And it's basically just saying we want the ability to protect our access to those resources. But it came at a time, and it was put forward in a way that seemed quite assertive. And then, of course, you had everything going on in the South China Sea and the East China Sea with Vietnam and the Philippines and Japan. And China saying that this is our core interest now, the South China Sea, which had kind of been understood, right? Within China, that's how they'd understood it. And even outside China, we kind of knew that they felt that way, but had never been stated explicitly. And so the Chinese all of a sudden were giving voice to a lot of things that many people may have thought were sort of implicit, but now they were pushed to the fore. So the question is, is the new Chinese government going to take a step back, or are they going to continue on this assertive push? My feeling is that what we're seeing is a sort of bifurcated foreign policy. That is to say, on the security front, I think they're going to continue to be pretty assertive. And I think a lot of nationalism. Xi Jinping has stressed significantly, frankly, within his first few months, the importance of strengthening the Chinese military. He spends a lot of time visiting with Chinese military and talking about how important they are and the need to make sure that they have a very strong and powerful military. And I think all the actions that we've seen in the East and South China Sea suggest that that China's not prepared to take a step back. Have not shown very much interest in negotiating these conflicts, these territorial sovereignty conflicts out. So I think we're going to see China continue to be assertive on the security front. I think on the economic front, however, they also want to move forward. So even as they have this very challenging issue that they're dealing with Japan, they're talking about moving forward on the free trade agreement with Japan and with South Korea, and then pushing forward on a regional free trade agreement. And I think they very much want to be seen, continue to be seen as a sort of positive engine of economic growth, for the entire region. So I think we'll have, positive moves on the economic front, China continuing to put itself forward as an important player that wants to engage, win-win Chinese diplomacy, which is what we had up until about 2010. But on the security front, I think it's going to be difficult times. I think it's going to be a pretty nationalistic China that emerges. I think it's also maybe important to remember or to bear in mind that in many respects, sort of China's rise to global power has really been premised on its sort of economic rise, right? And it's really just its economic prowess that has brought it to this space. It hasn't, in fact, been its military might, and it hasn't been its sort of diplomatic strength. And in many respects, it's the international community that has foisted upon China, its demands for China to engage in many more issues than China ever had to engage in before. So everything from Syria and Iran and cyber and G20. What are you going to do in the G20? And we want you to partner on 1,000 different issues. And the Chinese, frankly speaking, were not ready. And so I think in many instances when we feel in the United States that we've extended our hand and said, come work with us on this, sometimes they legitimately don't want to work with us on it. They have different priorities. And in some cases, they're simply not prepared. It's interesting, within the Chinese foreign policy establishment, it is in many respects very thin. You would think that the Chinese would have a very deep bench of sort of top diplomats, but in fact, they don't. They have a thin bench of people who combine both diplomatic skills, strong English, and substantive, or expert knowledge of a range of issues. So you find that the same person who is a lead negotiator on climate change becomes the lead negotiator on the G20. And I was talking to him. He's no longer either of those things, but I was talking to him, and he said, I don't know anything about these financial and economic issues. I had to spend 6 months learning about them. Now, you would think that the Chinese would have any number of people that could occupy that position within the G20, but clearly they didn't. So I think it's just, when we're thinking about our own dealings with China in the international space, I think it is important to remember that in many instances, their inability to play in the way that we want them to play with us may be due as much to sort of their own need to reevaluate their foreign policy principles that they've held, sort of their own new role in the world that they haven't quite adjusted to, and then again, some perhaps lack of capacity within their own foreign policy structure. Okay, last but not least, let me say a few words about my favorite. I'm sorry, it's just dark and I'm trying to keep track of my time here. My favorite issue, because I think it's perhaps the most exciting space in China today and the most dynamic space, and that is the internet. I remember several years back, a lot of China analysts in the States would talk about the internet in China as something that was largely an elite phenomenon, right? Simply, intellectuals, people in urban areas, youth playing games in cyber cafes. Didn't really think about the impact that the internet might have. But today, there are 500 to 600 million Chinese who are on the internet. 90% of them have computers in their homes, and 20% of them are in rural China. So it has become a mass phenomenon, not an elite phenomenon. And for my money, I think, and I've written this, I just like this phrase, I think it's really becoming a virtual political system. And it is bringing to the country a kind of transparency, official accountability, and rule of law in some respects that the official system does not bring to the Chinese people. So in the case of air quality or the Wenzhou train accident or any number of issues that we've seen here that have risen to the fore in the Chinese sort of public sphere, you can track the progress via the internet. I mean, this issue of the Beijing air quality, which began a year and a quarter ago or so, back in December really of 2011, really started because the American embassy in Beijing was tweeting the air quality statistics for these PM 2.5, right? And then the Chinese people were kind of like, why aren't these statistics not matching up with our statistics? With 700 planes grounded, and our government is saying it's a blue sky day, there's a problem here. And the US NBC saying stay inside their hazardous levels of pollutants. So that's what really broke open the dam here. It was the internet. And from that point on, you had all sorts of players coming to the fore. A Chinese billionaire real estate developer, Pan Shui, who put a poll on the Chinese internet and said, because the Chinese government then said, fine, we will publish these PM 2.5 statistics, because they were not publishing them, even though they had the numbers, they weren't putting them out there because they didn't want to. And they said, we'll put them out in 2016. And then this billionaire real estate developer does this poll, and he says, how many of you want them to do it in 2016, and how many of you want them to do it now? And of course, the vast majority, now over 90%, said, we want you to put them out now. And so, then Beijing, they were forced to do it. There was enormous bottom-up pressure, not without a fight, of course. They swung back at, the US and said, you have to stop publishing these statistics. This is a Vienna Convention. You're violating the Vienna Convention. This issue of sovereignty, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so, but in the end, it has transformed the debate on China and the environment, right? And on China and the air pollution and the demand and necessity for transparency within the system. If you would think back a couple of years to the Wenzhou train accident, right? There's a case where, you can remember the pictures perhaps, they were in the newspapers here, of the local officials trying to bury part of the train, right? They're trying to cover this up. But, the Chinese people on the train and the local townspeople, they're out there, with their phones, taking pictures, putting them on the web. They're all over the place. There's no ability for these officials to hide now, right? There's no ability for them to put this under the cloak of darkness. And so not only did they get the pictures out, not only were some local officials fired and the railway ministry, people hit, but huge sort of, investigation into corruption in the railway ministry. But also Beijing was forced and held accountable, in terms of launching a real investigation into this and then compensating people, right? So that people never let it drop. They followed it through on the internet. And there are many, many cases. You think Bo Xilai, the situation with the Chongqing party secretary, his family's wealth, obviously his wife's complicity in the murder of this British citizen, that any of that would have been publicized, within the entire country a decade ago, were it not for the internet? No way. So I think that the internet really is having a transformative impact on not only Chinese society and their ability to participate in the political process, which, by the way, I should say they also do, in terms of the protests now on the ground. It's not just people coming out and marching around, but they actually organize via the internet, right? So in Xiamen, they say, come, let's march against this polluting factory that the local government wants to put 4 kilometers outside the city center in gross violation of all our environmental regulations. Wear a yellow armband and come out. And then you have, somewhere between 7,000 and 20,000 Chinese marching in Xiamen over the course of a weekend. So the internet's really transforming sort of the interactions among the Chinese people themselves, and I think also forcing a new kind of social compact between the state and society. So for my money, this is the most fun, the most exciting area, the most dynamic area of change in China today.
Quite curious the degree of commitment the CFR has to a one-world government.
I don't think we have a commitment to a one-world government. There is no CFR that has any policy. The interesting thing about the Council on Foreign Relations is that it is made up of individuals who have individual perspectives, so that there are a number of us, for example, who deal with the issue of Asia. I have a whole team of people, one of whom just wrote a book on the decline of democracy, which has gotten a lot of attention. I don't agree with almost anything that he's written in the book, but I love the fact that we can have, an open and vibrant debate. And, I hired him, and I'm not going to fire him because I disagree with him. We represent, the full range of ideas. So I think if you look at our writings, actually, on the web or what we publish, more formally in op-eds or anywhere, you will see that there is no single CFR perspective at all. That, in fact, it really is a very wide-ranging and intellectually dynamic, disparate place.
Thank you. Other questions on this side?
Thank you.
Yes, could you say a few words about China's relationship with North Korea and how they can be helpful or perhaps not helpful at the present time?
Sure. I think North Korea right now is one of the most interesting issues to look at in terms of what's going on in Chinese foreign policy. 2 years ago, a friend of mine at Beijing University, Zhu Feng, wrote a piece saying that North Korea was the most divisive issue within the Chinese foreign policy community. At that time, though, that was not evident to anybody outside China, certainly. That was not public. There wasn't really room for public debate on the issue of North Korea. Today, that has changed in 180 degrees. And so you can, not only is there a wide-ranging debate among Chinese scholars, academics and think tank people like me, from the perspective that that North Korea is a millstone around our neck, and we need to get rid of it, and we should be thinking about reunification. We should be preparing for the collapse of the North Korean state. You can see all of these things now. You have that group, and you have the more traditional one that says the reason that North Korea behaves the way it does is because the U.S., South Korea, and Japan make it feel insecure by their actions, right? So this debate now is very wide-ranging and very vibrant. The question of where the Chinese government is going to land, I think, remains open because even the Chinese media continues to put forth different perspectives. And until I start seeing the Chinese media come out with a single line, I think the debate is still ongoing. I would suspect Xi Jinping at the Boao Forum made it clear he's not happy with North Korea. Right? He made that clear. He said people shouldn't be causing these problems, and everybody knows he was referring to North Korea. Although some people in China said maybe he was talking about the U.S., but it was pretty clear he was talking about North Korea. The question of what are they going to do about it, beyond what they've already done in terms of working with us on sanctions, are they going to, yes, turn off the spigot on the oil, right? Are they going to do something with their food? Because they supply North Korea with the vast majority of their food and energy. I wouldn't be surprised if they try to talk to North Korea and North Korea doesn't take a step back, to see them do something like they did back, over a decade ago now, and halt the oil supplies for a few days or maybe even longer. There was a report that the supplies had dropped over the past month, but I haven't really been able to investigate that further. So I think it's open. But I think there's a lot of frustration in the government in Beijing. But for them to completely reverse course, I mean, I wouldn't expect that, certainly not in the near term. But I think they're getting to the point where they're really wondering, aside from being able to access all these raw materials that they get from North Korea, and the fact that they still continue to feel that North Korea provides a little bit of a buffer against an otherwise very American-centric region, there's not much that they're getting but a giant headache from Kim Jong-un now.
Could you talk a little bit about China and Africa? And there's a lot of conversation about what their motives are in their development there, and what you think.
Sure. Actually, this is a part of the new book that I have coming out with a colleague of mine in January. It's called By All Means Necessary. Okay, that's a plug for my book. I think the Chinese, but it really deals with China's resource quest. So I think there are two different things going on. Number one, China has a long tradition of engagement in Africa. And leaders like Mugabe, right, have a long tradition of Chinese friendship, with China. Many different African leaders have had, these kinds of friendships. Sudan has a Chinese-Sudanese friendship society dating back to the 1960s. So there is a long tradition of Chinese engagement. This isn't something simply born of the past several years. It's certainly become, much more in the media in the past few years. I think the number one priority of China in Africa is gaining access to resources. Right? China wants resource security, whether you're talking about sort of energy and oil, or you're talking about minerals. China consumes, in a number of different commodities, 50% of the world's, 25% of the world's commodities are now going to China. It wants to have security, right, in those resources to continue to fuel its economic growth. And it's not, even though, for example, in the area of oil, like 90% of what the Chinese help to bring online goes on to the open market, there's still a sense within China that somehow doing the direct investment will give them a greater sense of security, right? That they have a pipeline, that they can bring it, I think, directly back to China. You also see China going out for agriculture, right? And beginning to send their farmers out to farm in Kenya, for example. So, and buying up land in some countries as well to gain security for their agricultural resources. So I think primarily their interest in Africa is economic. I think it is born of this drive to access resources. But I think there's also, a broader sort of political agenda, I think, in some of which has to do with the United States, certainly, in the sense that, China is looking for friends everywhere. And there's, always a sense that somehow the United States holds the greater weight of world favor in its hands, right? So who's going to be friends with China? And if push came to shove, and China and the United States were, on opposite sides of the fence, right, which we kind of are anyway, but really in some, ratcheting up some sort of battle, who is going to stand with China? Because, on the face of it, doesn't seem like there'd be all that many countries. So China wants to ensure that even if those countries aren't going to line up behind China, they're also not going to line up behind the United States at the very least. So I think it really is out there also just seeking friends. And I think if you look at the structure of a lot of these organizations that China is beginning to develop, like, or not China's developing necessarily, but that China is part of, like the BASIC countries or the BRICS or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a lot of that, again, has to deal with simply finding friends and developing greater bargaining power as it attempts to negotiate and navigate with the United States. But if I had to think about Africa, by and large, I think of it as an economic play. That's not to say that some of the way they do business is not so good, but that's a different issue.
Thank you. Other questions back here? Excuse me.
China owns a huge quantity of U.S. dollars in their foreign reserves, and I've heard numerous debates about how they might use that as leverage against us. And I was wondering if you've ever spent any time thinking through the various scenarios and can contemplate a situation where we did something that upset them, that they turned around and use those foreign reserves against us in some form or fashion.
I think I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, I will say up front. My general sense is that that's a lose-lose proposition, right? Because yes, they hold a lot of U.S. debt. I don't know, right at this moment, it may be that Japan holds more. They've been back and forth in recent months. It had been China for the past couple of years. Before that, it was Japan, and then recently it seemed like Japan was coming into the #1 position. We never had that issue. We don't talk about Japan in that way, even though they hold a larger percent of our foreign held debt, or have in the past in any case. People tend to talk about it as it's mutually assured destruction, right? Because if all of a sudden they tried to just sell off large quantities of the debt, then the value of the debt would go down, and they would lose a lot of money. And so there doesn't seem to be any indication that is a scenario that they have constructed really in their own head to play out. Not that I've seen. When Premier Wen Jiabao came here a few years ago, he just talked about the need for the U.S. to maintain a strong economy and the interrelationship between the U.S. and Chinese economies because they're concerned about their investments, right? So I tend to see it a little bit differently. I mean, there may be some scenario where they could manage that in a way that would be harmful to us. I mean, at least perceptually, perhaps, right? That if the Chinese were, drawing down their holdings in a way that somehow, and the rest of the world would think, oh, there must be something wrong with the U.S. economy. But I don't even see that happening. I think most of the rest of the world's more sophisticated than that.
Thank you. We've got a question on the far side here.
Excuse me. I'm curious about something. Who funds the CFR? And do you have different government funding coming to you? And do you have outside funding coming to you? Who pays your salary?
So I am the CV Star Senior Fellow, and so my funding comes from the Star Foundation. We get funding from the MacArthur Foundation. We get funding, from various foundations. We take no money from the U.S. government. It's a restriction that we place on ourselves because we want to provide, what we consider to be impartial policy analysis and maintain that divide between the government and the council. We have corporations. We have a corporate program where they pay to come to meetings, and that money feeds into the salaries of some of our fellows who can't otherwise raise money. But there's no direct one-to-one, I'm going to pay your salary from a corporation that would drive a fellow to adopt a certain perspective. So that's how we fund ourselves. We go out and we raise money mostly from foundations, and our members pay fees as well. Council is a membership-based organization, which differs from many think tanks, and they pay fees, and that contributes as well to the running of the council.
Is there any equivalent in China of independent think tanks or this type of organization?
There is not actually an equivalent to the Council on Foreign Relations. We have what we call a council of councils, where we have relations with think tanks, around the world, exchange ideas, and other academics and scholars who are publishing on foreign policy writ large. China does not have the equivalent. We kind of tried, frankly, against my advice, to have a relationship with one that's under the government, has government sponsored, because they're all government sponsored, really, in the foreign policy field. There are some in the environmental field that are independent, but not in the foreign policy field. And it did not work out. So there is kind of one in Hong Kong, a little bit, called the Hong Kong Forum, but it's very different. They don't really produce independent analysis. It's just a kind of meeting forum. We have a little bit of a relationship with them, but not much. So unfortunately, no. But we do at the council, our Asia team certainly does a lot with Chinese universities, and we've done joint projects and had joint research projects, and have had dialogue on security issues related to the U.S. and Asia over the past years. I'm going to one at Beijing University in June, for example. We held the first one; they're holding the second one. So we have relationships like that, but they're informal and kind of one-off. There's no sustained relationship.
You mentioned that the leadership is mainly coastal and not interior. It would seem with the poor interior, most of the funding is for the coastal areas. What are the implications for the economy? Are they working towards improving the interior, or are they going to have a conflict there?
Right. So back in 1998, and then sort of into 2000, they launched the sort of Go West strategy, which was in fact designed for the coastal provinces in part, and the international community in addition, to invest more in the interior provinces. So they did a lot of things to attract international investment to the interior parts of the country. For example, Chongqing, where Bo Xilai was, and Chengdu, which is right there as well, have been the recipients of a lot of foreign direct investment. They undertook a lot of efforts in those areas to attract that, to make, to give a lot of tax benefits and other things to companies that would come in and invest. That was part of government initiative. So they're trying to move, in many respects, what they're trying to do is move the manufacturing that has driven the coastal provinces, move some of that into the interior provinces. right? So you get the coastal provinces moving up the value chain, right, going to services and other things, and you get more manufacturing in the interior provinces where things like the rule of law, levels of education, et cetera, are still lower than they are in the coastal provinces. I think that's one big thrust of the development. And then the other is this urbanization process, because really many people within the Chinese government, and not all, in fact, there was just an article published by a scholar, and I can't remember from which university, saying urbanization is not the answer to income inequality and all of our problems. But there is a mindset to some extent that is what urbanization is going to do, that this is the way to bring people up by giving them jobs in the factories, and then eventually reforming the whole hukou system of residencies and everything, so that migrant workers actually can establish a residence in a city and can send their children to school in the city and get the healthcare benefits in the city. But these things are not in place right now. In fact, this scholar, and I'm going to get the number wrong, I can only say it's between 1.2 and 3.2 trillion dollars. They said if you were to take the 250 million migrant workers that they're talking about now, sort of giving them some kind of permanent urban residency, that's how much it would cost to do that. And so that's really not on the books in a significant way. But that's what they're thinking of. That's what they've been doing. I haven't heard of anything new that they want to do out of this leadership yet.
Got a question in the center, and we'll work our way back around.
This question may be a little bit related. I was wondering how they're handling the environmental issues in China, if there's a mechanisms at the national level, or if everything devolves onto the provinces and the local levels of activity in terms of remediation or prevention of environmental problems?
Oh, good. You never asked me that question. I spent 10 years writing my book on that topic. But okay, so where do I begin? No, just joking.
No.
I think, let me try to say just maybe three things about it. I think number one, the good news is the environment has risen very rapidly in sort of the public consciousness and on the agenda of the Chinese leadership. So a decade, 2 decades ago, it did not have the same kind of elite attention, or certainly the same kind of public awareness that it commands now. In terms of investment levels, it remains very low. So China only invests about 1.3% of its GDP in environmental protection, which is well below the more than 2% that the Chinese scientists say they should be investing just to keep the situation from deteriorating further, right? And it probably should be up closer to 3 or 4%, right? So levels of investment are low in environmental protection. They depend very much, to your point about the devolution of authority, they depend very much on local areas, right? So even when you look at the human resource investment at the very top, so within China's Ministry of Environmental Protection, so in Beijing, there are really only 300 full-time workers engaged in environmental protection, right, in that agency. There are many more that are structured down through the Environmental Protection Administration, throughout the country. A significant part of the problem is that all those local environmental protection bureaus that they have are beholden, they're nested, as they say, within the local governments, right? So salaries are paid there. The Ministry of Environmental Protection doesn't, there are dual lines of authority, but they don't pay the salaries, right? So they follow the guidance from the Ministry of Environmental Protection, but their political allegiance in many respects rests at the local areas, which, as you might imagine, there's a lot of pressure brought to bear. There has been a lot of pressure brought to bear traditionally on these local environmental protection officials to look the other way. Also a lot of opportunities for corruption and bribery and other things like that. So enforcement of environmental protection is quite weak. One of China's top environmental lawyers, Wang Canfa, he has his own NGO and he's a professor in Beijing as well, has said that only about 10% of China's environmental laws are adequately enforced. They have developed a new system of environmental courts. There are like 100 of them now within China to try to bring sort of specialized expertise into the court system, because part of the problem was that judges sometimes were just retired PLA officials, right, People's Liberation Army officials. They don't know anything about specifics of environmental issues, and so they have these specialized courts, but they don't have enough cases to fill the courts because also who can bring lawsuits, who can bring these things to bear is also determined by the Chinese government. So that's another problem, right? So they've got all these courts with excess capacity. So the institutional infrastructure really for environmental protection doesn't really serve environmental protection. A few years back, the ministry really wanted to take hold of the local ones and sort of bring them under its authority, but basically they were told, well, you'll have to pay for it. They have no capacity to pay for that. So that's one huge challenge. I think, again, one of the great, the saving graces of the environment at this point is the emergence of civil society around this issue, because the environment really has been at the forefront of civil society development. So there are probably more environmental NGOs than almost any other kind of NGO. I should be careful about saying that, but it's probably pretty close to true, at least formally recognized ones, and they cover every kind of issue now. They used to really be just environmental education and sort of what they considered to be relatively non-threatening issues, but now they launch protests against dams, they do investigative reporting, they push things on transparency, they harass multinationals, they do all sorts of very proactive and aggressive kinds of environmental lobbying and activities. So I think that's one of the great new developments, that in the media. But it's not enough to compensate for the otherwise, sort of institutional weaknesses.
Every now and then you hear about a tremendous skewness of males to females of the age group 20 and under. Is that really a problem? And if so, how might that impact the future economic development and politics of China?
It's certainly a problem for the guys. Yeah, it's a problem. I think, the whole issue of the one-child policy, which is in some ways at the heart of this issue of the imbalance, right? Because the girls are less desired, or traditionally have been less desired. I think that's less true now than it was in many urban areas, right? That a lot of urban couples don't have necessarily that same preference. It was really driven, I think, originally because of being out in rural areas. You wanted boys, and plus you wanted them to take care of you in your old age and stuff. But that's changing a little bit now. But I think what it really is going to take is the reform of the one-child policy, and that's another area I think that's where reform is kind of in the wind. There was institutional reform that happened at this governmental restructuring that might make a difference. The architect of the one-child policy from 30 years ago now came out last year at the 30-year mark and said this policy was supposed to end after 30 years. The one-child policy was never supposed to continue sort of in perpetuity, right? Because it is producing these kinds of imbalances, and plus, we're looking at a situation, where our population is aging so rapidly, right? That we have a real problem with the demographics in that respect. And so, there's been talk about experiments of, letting people have more children. At this point, if you're an only child, married to an only child, you can have 2 children. I think that will help to redress this sort of, male-female imbalance. Look, there have been some, I think, maybe speculative studies that have talked about what the imbalance might mean in terms of, men not being, if men aren't married, then they're not rooted in communities, right? Then do they cause more trouble, right? Do they, so that both domestically, and do they become more nationalistic? There's all sorts of theories about what will happen if you don't have, men able to become married. Prostitution, sex trafficking. I mean, you can extend these kinds of things pretty far out. I don't know how much of it actually holds, but that's the kind of speculative thinking that is certainly out there in the literature. I think the Chinese government is quite aware, certainly aware of the issue. I expect this may be an area, again, where I think over the next 3 years or so, we might see some reform emerging.
I really enjoyed your perspective on the internet, how it affected or is affecting China. But I'm also curious about one other thing. When they took over Hong Kong, what effect, like capitalism, financing, wealth, manufacturing, how did that affect China from your perspective?
I think at the time of the well, I guess we call it the takeover. But anyway, when Hong Kong reverted to the mainland, I think there was a lot of debate over, whether the mainland was somehow, Hong Kong was going to become subsumed within the mainland, right? So what was taking place was going to resemble much more mainland, or whether maybe Hong Kong was going to be the tail that would, lead the dog, or tail lead the dog. But anyway, wag the dog. Right. So I'm like, oh, so that didn't sound right. And I think neither one of those has actually happened. And what, in fact, there was, I think, a big push initially to take some sort of Hong Kong officials, some regulators, finance regulators, et cetera, bring them to Beijing. There was this idea that somehow the way that Hong Kong had developed its sort of financial regulatory system, et cetera, could be imported into China. That kind of, the civil service, the corruption-free, elements of Hong Kong could be brought to the mainland. That certainly has not happened, right? Not that there hasn't been any learning, there has been, but you certainly haven't seen the mainland begin to replicate the Hong Kong experience. I think what you have seen, I think to the surprise of many in Beijing and unhappiness of many in Beijing, is a continued and determined effort on the part of many in Hong Kong to maintain a pretty strong sense, independent sense of political self. And so every time you see Beijing try in some way, whether through education or through legal sort of mechanisms to try to change Hong Kong, to try to bring it more into the sort of Chinese fold, the mainland fold, you see a lot of pushback from the Hong Kong people. So I think this, clearly not in the same way that Tibet or Xinjiang causes Beijing problems, but it has, I think, proved to be far more of a headache for Beijing than maybe they had anticipated. So I don't think either of the sort of predictive models that people were sketching out in terms of influence have really come to pass.
We're here in this center.
Thank you. Yeah, China is not a religious society, particularly, and yet they have to interact in its search for petroleum resources with the Middle East, which is full of very religious societies. What approach do they use when they do that?
I think it's not so much that it's a problem that China's not a religious society. I think many in China are religious, in fact. There are pockets, very strong pockets of religion, both formal, recognized by the state religion, and informal and house religion. So I think religion certainly exists in China in very important ways, and so I think that does happen. I think the issue for China is more how it deals with sort of the Muslim population within China, like the Uyghurs and Xinjiang, et cetera, and ensuring that nothing it does with regard to that population somehow activates unhappiness in the Middle East. I think by and large they conduct business. Right? They conduct business, one state to the other, business to business, business person to business person. There are partnerships between, Saudi Aramco and some of the Chinese national oil companies. I think, look, there's also an element of authoritarianism in both regions that's probably appealing in many respects to the leaders, right? It's not like Saudi Arabia is a great democracy or something. So I think they can find, other ways to connect outside a sort of religious, a religious connection. But I think that the issue is really just ensuring that they don't strike too hard in a way that will disrupt the business relations. So far, they seem to have managed that reasonably well.
Is there still much of a push for integration with Taiwan?
There is still a push for integration with Taiwan. I mean, I think Taiwan has been one of the bright spots if we're going to think about sort of China's relations, well, let's just say with the United States, even Taiwan is a bright spot. If you want to put Taiwan as a part of that relationship, which I think it has been a pretty important part of the relationship. The relationship between Taiwan and the mainland today is probably better than it's almost ever been. And that's largely due to the president of Taiwan, Ma Ying-jeou, who's managed a very careful balancing act. He has push forward, and open the doors in the economic ways to the mainland. He has sort of tamped down, dropped down certainly the rhetoric of the DPP, the other party that was previously in power, sort of the independence rhetoric. He doesn't share that, doesn't talk about that. At the same time, he has, for the most part, managed to give those people in Taiwan who are not interested in eventual reunification a sense that he is still protecting their interests. Not all the time, but I think he's done a reasonable job. Just in the past week or so, Taiwan signed an agreement with Japan on fishing agreement, in the East China Sea. Okay, Beijing, very not happy about this, right? Because this is the major issue that they have with Japan, not the fishing issue, but the territorial issue. And to have Taiwan then go and strike a separate agreement, like that should not be happening, right? Because really, in their minds, Taiwan doesn't have a foreign policy that should be independent of the mainland's foreign policy. So they've expressed their displeasure with it. They haven't really done more than that, but no way. I mean, they're unhappy. So I think Taiwan is trying, they're no longer making a big bid for membership in the UN and this kind of thing. So they've drawn back, they've drawn down some of their expectations. And the mainland in response, I think, has given them a little bit more room to play. But overall, right, in the mainland in China, the percentage of people that think that it would be okay if Taiwan were not to reunify, maybe 1%. I mean, there is still, very strong belief in the mainland, that this is going to happen, and they've allowed themselves to think that it's going to happen through economic integration, right? That as Taiwan and the mainland get more integrated economically, that naturally somehow there's going to be a progression politically. But if you spend any time in Taiwan, that's not true, right? Because a very significant part of the population is not interested in political reunification. Certainly not in the way that, mainland China exists today politically.
To what extent will rapid economic growth and an increase in entrepreneurship in China lead to political, particularly democratic reform?
So I guess I would say that one of the great debates has been whether or not China has developed its own model and is not following the trajectory of the United States or almost any other country in the world in terms of the rising middle class becoming a force for pushing for greater political freedoms. Some people have said, well, China's proved otherwise, right? You can have this. China hasn't proved otherwise. It's just entered the level of what is typically considered a middle class income at $6,000 US dollars or so per capita GDP. So it's just at the beginning of this. I think more importantly, what we've seen is that entrepreneurs in China can actually be pretty proactive on the political reform front. Not necessarily calling for the overthrow of the Chinese government, not that kind of political reform. But as I mentioned, Pan Shiri, real estate billionaire, using the web, right, to sort of do a poll about what the local government, what Beijing should be doing about the air quality. When Taiwan had its elections, a very wealthy Chinese took a group of other very wealthy Chinese, millionaires and maybe I think a few billionaires as well, over to Taiwan to observe the elections, right, and then come back and blog about it, right, because a lot of these millionaires have blogs, Weibo accounts where they post their ideas and their thoughts. So I think there's the potential for these entrepreneurs to be a slowly pushing force for change, right? I don't see them, I mean, look, their fortunes have been made and are very much tied up with the political system that exists today. They're not looking to overthrow the leadership, but I do think that a number of them feel that their own world and the lives of their children would benefit from sort of a greater political space. And you can see that in the fact that many of them are sending their children to study in the United States. And not just study to college, but to sending them to the boarding schools. In the same way that a lot of people from Korea have sent their children to boarding schools, now you see huge numbers of Chinese starting to come to U.S. high schools. So I think that's and also one interesting thing is the there have been a couple of studies done of the Chinese wealthy, the Chinese rich, looking at the numbers that are emigrating and the numbers that want to move to the United States, mostly the United States, Canada, and Australia, and why they want to leave. And the issues are healthcare, education, environment, security of assets, right? Because they're afraid. If you look at what the sort of poorer people in China say what they're most concerned about, they're almost the exact same issues, right? So there's this parallel, right, between the very wealthy and the middle class, right, and even the lower class within China. These social issues are enormously important to them. So I think that fundamentally, what the entrepreneurs bring to the table is an ability to be more proactive if they want, right, to have their voices heard. And I think a number of them are taking advantage of that. So I see them, not entirely, but a number of them in any case, as a force for gradual political change.